Get him out. Now. The words didn't come out as a shout. They slid across the glass case and the linoleum like a cold draft, the kind you feel in your ribs more than your ears. Heads turned anyway. One of the clerks, barely old enough to rent a car, smirked without looking up from his screen. A couple near the ammo shelf froze in place like they'd walked into a church at the wrong moment. And the old man at the counter, Elias Gray Mercer, shifted his weight off his bad leg, let out a small breath, and set his palm flat on the glass like he was steadying a picture frame. He wasn't there to buy anything flashy. He wasn't there to make a point. He just wanted to hold a piece of wood. And steel he'd known half a lifetime ago. The rifle hung on the back wall, polished the way museum pieces get polished, a little too shiny to feel real. He asked for it the way you ask for salt in a diner. Plain voice, eyes steady, no drama. And somehow that was the part that bothered the kid behind the counter most. The calm, "Look, Grandpa," the kid said, tapping the display screen with his knuckle like he needed backup from the cash register. "It's heavier than it looks. It's not for, browsing." Elias didn't flinch. He was 60 seconds careful about everything these days. He measured his steps like he'd learned to measure breath in places where sound carried too far. "I carried one farther than this counter," he said. "I can manage it to the edge and back." Another chuckle from the second clerk, the one with the perfect haircut and the nervous laugh that tried to sound tough. "We're not a museum, sir." He added the "sir" like it was a bandage he remembered at the last second. "If you're not buying, you're blocking the view." The air shifted. Not in a big way. Nobody gasped, nobody argued. It was smaller than that. The country song, leaking from the ceiling speaker, seemed a little too cheerful for the moment. Dust motes drifted slower. Elias glanced down at his hand on the glass. His knuckles were pale and square, the hand of a man who'd held on through storms. He gave the tiniest nod, the kind you give when the decision's already made. "Understood," he said. The word landed soft. He lifted his hand, turned, and walked. No limp when he could help it, just a measured rhythm that made you wonder how much practice it took to make pain look that quiet. He didn't see the woman by the ammo rack watch him go. Ball cap low, gym shirt, the kind of person you forget as soon as you walk past. She waited 2 beats after the door chime, stepped outside, and pulled a phone from her pocket like it belonged to someone else. She said 3 words, simple as a grocery list. He was there. Inside, the clerks went back to their thumbs. One of them tossed out a joke about early bird discounts. A father and son drifted in, the kind of Saturday errand you do when the game doesn't start for another hour. Life kept doing what it always does, moving, ignoring, assuming. That's how it usually goes for guys like Elias. The world gets loud and fast, and the quiet ones become part of the wallpaper. The sky outside had that January brightness that fools you into thinking it's warm. Elias moved down the sidewalk past the bait shop that always smelled like damp rope and memory, past the hardware place with shovels lined up like soldiers waiting on orders. He took the long way back, because he always did. Shortcuts were for people in a hurry to miss something important. His house sat 3 blocks over, small and low, the paint a faded tan that didn't bother anybody. In the front window, a crooked Venetian blind stuck halfway down. There was a thin line of soil along the sill where he kept meaning to repot a plant. Inside smelled like coffee and old paper. The kind of place you can navigate with your eyes closed because you've put every object where it makes sense in your bones. He hung his jacket on the chair back where it's carved a groove, then walked to the hallway closet that sticks on humid days, even when it's not humid. He tugged once, twice, and the door gave up like it always does. On the top shelf, a shoebox that had never held shoes. The lid slid back with that dry whisper cardboard makes. He didn't keep medals out. He never liked how they looked under normal light, too shiny for the rooms they sat in. But there were other things. A dog tag rubbed dull from years of being a worry stone. A patch with a corner scorched. Still smells like something he doesn't describe. A folded paper napkin with a 4-digit grid coordinate written in a younger hand. He touched each thing without looking at it long, the way you check the locks before bed. Not out of fear. Habit. He closed the box and sat at the small kitchen table that had one short leg and a coaster under it to even things out. The window over the sink framed the alley where a stray cat liked the sun on the cinder block wall. He watched the patch of light and let the heat in his chest fade. It happened fast now. These little brush fires are being seen the wrong way. He'd learned not to pour water on them. He learned to stand still, let the wind change, let it burn out. He made coffee. Black. He took the first sip standing at the sink the way he always did, like he was still in someone else's house, and didn't want to leave a ring on their table. When it cooled, he sat and pulled a paperback across the table. A library discard about fly fishing that he'd read twice without ever touching a river. He liked the way it talked about patience without bragging about it. Across town, the bait shop owner, who'd been watching through his window when the old man left, asked himself for the third time why the kid had to laugh. In the hardware store, a clerk bent down to adjust a row of snow shovels that were already perfect. Small things, barely worth saying out loud. But the air had that feeling you get right before a summer storm, the stillness that makes your skin pay attention. Back at the gun shop, a couple more customers drifted through. A woman in a fleece jacket asked about cleaning kits. The father and son argued quietly about whether the son should save up for a safe first. The younger clerk took a picture of the wall display for his personal feed and added a caption with a lightning emoji. Nothing unusual. Nothing at all. But outside at 11:43, a matte black SUV eased into the lot and clicked into park without a sound. The engine kept humming, like a heartbeat at rest. Then another pulled in, nose to nose with the first. Then a third. If you were watching, you might have thought it looked like a slow-motion chess lesson. No rush. No show. We're not there yet, though. Right now, the heartbeat of this story is still in the kitchen with Elias, where the clock on the stove is 5 minutes fast, because it's been 5 minutes fast since 2002, and no one bothered to fix it. He rinsed his mug and set it on the rack. He pulled a flannel from the back of a chair and shrugged into it. The room felt like late afternoon, even though it wasn't. Time gets weird when you live alone and keep good habits. He looked at his cap on the hook by the door, the one with the team patch. The stitching worn thin at the brim. He didn't reach for it. Not today. He stepped outside without it, pulled the door closed, and tested the knob. The air carried a hint of smoke from someone's fireplace, and the faint sweetness of a bakery 2 streets over. He started walking. On the way, he passed a faded mural that used to be a map of the town. The paint had peeled in the corners where the seasons pick at it, but you could still trace the river like a blue ribbon. A kid on a scooter zipped by and glanced up at him without the quick flicker of judgment grown-ups sometimes have. The kid's eyes were clean, curious, uninterested in labels. Elias liked that. It made the morning settle into a better shape. He stopped by the diner because he always stopped by the diner. Black coffee, no sugar. The waitress with the silver bangles knew his cadence and could hear him coming before the bell above the door made its tired jingle. She slid the mug onto the table before he sat and said the same thing she always said, which was nothing more than, "Mornin', Mr. Mercer." He nodded. He liked that she used his name. Not sir. Not buddy. Names matter. There's a way small-town diners hold silence that feels like respect, not emptiness. Forks scrape. A busboy laughs in the back. A radio murmurs an old love song. Nobody hurries you. He watched the steam thin above his coffee and let the window show him the street. He could see the corner of the gun shop lot from here if he leaned, but he didn't. He watched the crosswalk instead. He watched the dog decide to sit. He watched a woman in a bright red coat stop and tie her shoe. At the counter, 2 men in work jackets were talking about a local team. One of them said something that made the other laugh hard, that honest kind of laughter that shakes your shoulders and leaves you brighter. The cook rang the bell and said, "Order up," like he meant, "Life is fine. Have breakfast." It was all so normal, it almost had the fault line running under it. Because across town, those SUVs have become the kind of detail that wakes up even people who don't notice things. Engines idling in careful unison. Doors closed. No one getting out. The shop manager, who'd been out on a supply run, pulled his truck into a spot, saw the lineup, and did the math without numbers. He killed his engine and sat a second with his hands on the wheel. Then he took a breath and went inside. The clerk with the perfect hair glanced at the door and then quickly back to his screen, like he could unsee a thing if he looked at it fast enough. The younger one made a joke about a car club that nobody answered. Somebody's grandma walked in and asked for a holster like she'd asked for a loaf of bread, and the clerk on autopilot pointed to an aisle, people and patterns. That's all a day is until it isn't. Back at the diner, the second coffee cooled slower. Elias folded the paper napkin in half and then again made a small square. He wasn't waiting on anything except warmth to return to his hands. He had the look of someone who has practiced contentment. You can spot it when you know what to look for. The way shoulders sit, the way the jaw stays soft. It's not resignation. It's a hard-won truce. The waitress topped him off without asking, set the pot down for a second, and said, "You doing okay today?" It wasn't the question. It was the way she asked it, like a door left on a latch. He gave the kind of smile that's mostly in the eyes and said, "Good coffee." She accepted that for what it was and let the conversation end there. Sometimes care means not pushing. Out the window, a bus slowed and hissed and opened its door to nobody. A gust tossed a paper cup into the gutter, where it spun once and lay still. He watched the spin. There are entire days where this would have been a headline for him, the way a thing spins and stops. That's the secret no one tells you about getting older. The world gets quieter, so the small details grow roots. He didn't mind. Roots are good. They keep you from blowing away. At 11:41, his phone buzzed once on the table. A number he didn't recognize. He watched it buzz again, then stop. He didn't pick it up. He didn't even reach. He sipped his coffee and let it ring through the silence like a pebble dropped in a deep well. At 11:43, the bell over the diner door gave a soft jingle nobody noticed. Outside, down the block, a line of vehicles idled like a thought getting ready to become a sentence. He set the mug down. The ceramic kissed the saucer. He glanced at the window, not because something told him to, but because the light shifted, infinitesimal, as if a cloud had remembered its job. The waitress caught the shift too. People who work mornings learn how to read light like weather. She looked at him, then at the street. He gave one nod, as if to say, let whatever's coming arrive on its own time. Back at the shop, 3 doors opened at the same moment, like a scene someone had rehearsed not to look like a scene. 12 men stepped out without hurry. Some wore jeans and jackets. Some wore crisp dress blues that caught the winter sun just so. It wasn't a show. It was a presence. Even from inside, the clerk could feel it, the way you can feel thunder coming long before you hear it. The younger one put his phone down, without knowing why. We'll get there. That entrance, the silence that follows, the stillness that explains more than speeches. We'll go back into that room with the glass cases and the humming fluorescence. We'll stand in the doorway with them. But for a last moment, stay at the diner. Stay with Elias, who paid with exact change because he always did, who slid the bills under the edge of the mug and left a folded napkin square where it could be thrown away without unfolding. He stood, tested the stiffness in his left knee, found the line down his spine that makes standing reliable. He put on his jacket. He didn't reach for the cap on the hook because he hadn't brought it. He touched the door with his palm like it was a friend he trusted and stepped into the light that had shifted just a little. You can call this a start if you want, but the truth is, all this began years ago, in places marked on maps with numbers instead of names. Today is just the day everyone else catches up. The woman by the ammo rack didn't follow Elias out for drama. She followed because something about the way he'd said, understood, stuck like a splinter. Her name was Maya Rios. Ball cap low, gym shirt. Keys hooked to a carabiner because she lost things if they weren't clipped to her. She stepped into the winter light, let the door fall shut behind her, and took 3 steps away from the window so the clerks couldn't see her face. The lot was half empty, the kind of quiet where you hear your own breath. She pulled her phone and scrolled past names until she landed on one that never needed more than 3 words. He picked up on the second ring. No hello. She didn't give one either. He was there, she said. There was a sound on the line, like a chair moving across a concrete floor. Then a simple, steady copy. Maya hung up, slid the phone into her pocket, and stood still for a beat like a runner settling at the line. She wasn't military. Not officially. She was the daughter of a man who came home whole on the outside and didn't talk much about the inside. She'd grown up learning how to read silence, how to listen to what someone didn't say. Years ago, a volunteer gig at a local clinic put her in a room with a retired medic who taught her the difference between being nosy and being useful. Useful meant doing what you could, then getting out of the way. She glanced once at the shop door, once at the road, and left like she just remembered she had groceries in the trunk. Inside, the clerks drifted back to their routine with the shaky relief people feel when a moment passes without consequences. The younger one, Tyler, pocketed his phone and tried to make his grin look natural again. He was good at pretending confidence. You learn that skill selling anything people don't really need. He told himself the old guy had been rude first. He told himself that's why it didn't sit right. But a small memory knocked on the back of his mind. His grandfather's closet. Cedar smell. A box on the shelf nobody touched. Tyler had never seen what was in it. He hadn't asked. He felt a wash of annoyance at a ghost that wasn't even in the room and pushed it down by double-checking the price tags on a row of scopes. The other clerk, Nate, set his jaw like a door you have to slam to get to latch. He wasn't a bad person. He just had a habit of filling quiet with jokes that sounded braver than he felt. He flicked his eyes toward the door and back again, then busied himself wiping a spotless glass case. The smear he was chasing didn't exist. He wiped harder. 3 blocks away, Elias took the long way home because that's how you make the day feel bigger, without spending a dime. He didn't rush. He never rushed. A wind moved a flag outside the post office in a lazy tilt, and somewhere a wind chime decided today was a minor key. He passed a barber shop, where a kid in a booster seat was sitting perfectly still for the first time in his life. He nodded at the barber, and the barber nodded back, 2 men exchanging a treaty of small acknowledgments. At the corner, the light changed, and he didn't bother pretending he cared. He waited. He could have crossed on red, and nobody would have minded, but he'd spent too many years learning how to move when movement mattered. You don't unlearn that. His knee complained the way old hinges complain, not to stop you, just to remind you they're there. He told it, in the privacy of his head, to hush. On his porch, he paused a second to wipe his boots on the mat, even though the mat gave up fighting dirt sometime around last summer. Inside, the house exhaled that familiar mix of coffee, paper, and the kind of clean you get from someone who keeps up with things as a form of thinking. He didn't flip on a light. He knew the room by heart. He set his jacket over the back of the chair, lined up the cuff with the edge because order helps when the rest of the world gets abstract. Then he walked down the hall to the closet again, the one that stuck and then gave way. He didn't take the shoebox down this time. He reached for a different thing, a small notebook no bigger than his palm. The cover had a wrinkle in it, where a bottle one sweated on a hot day. Inside, on the first page, was a list written in block letters. Not names, not places, just phrases. He let his finger rest on one line. Hold steady. He closed the book and put it back. He wasn't superstitious, but there are some rituals you don't mess with. Across town, Maya sat in her car with the radio off, hands on the wheel, eyes on nothing. She wasn't waiting. She was staying out of the way. You learn the difference when you spend hours in hospital hallways with families who don't know whether to sit or pace. Her phone buzzed once. A text. On my way. No punctuation. She replied with 3 dots she didn't send, then locked the screen. The gun shop door chimed for a man in a camouflage hat looking for a cleaning brush. He asked Nate a question, and Nate answered on autopilot. The man paid cash and left exactly as slowly as he'd come. That's how the world disguises pivots, by draping them in routine. Tyler glanced up, caught a reflection in the glass, and for a second saw his own face look older. He didn't like it. He blinked the feeling away. The manager, Walt, was 2 miles down the road arguing with a supplier over a back-ordered shipment of targets when his phone lit up with a picture message from a cousin who tagged him in everything. The shot was crooked and taken through a window, but it was a storefront all the same. 3 SUVs nose to nose in his lot, like ink blots on a test he didn't want to take. He played it off with a laugh in his voice and said to the supplier, "Hey, let me call you back." then didn't wait for an answer. He knew enough not to blow into a situation loud. He parked around back and came to the stockroom, a habit left over from years in retail, where the front door was for guests and the back door was for solving problems. He stepped out behind the counter with a nod, eyes scanning without making a show of it. Tyler started to say something, and then didn't. Walt felt the way the air sat in the room, and didn't ask dumb questions. He straightened the stack of forms with hands that wanted something to do. Outside, a kid on a BMX bike coasted along the edge of the lot, and tried not to stare too hard. He wasn't a bad kid. He just had an eye for moments that might matter later. He did a lazy circle and rode off, then thought better of it and circled back again, because sometimes you can feel a story forming the way you can feel a storm. He pulled his phone half out of his hoodie pocket and then shoved it back in. He didn't want to be that guy today. Elias stood at his sink, turned the tap for a second, and then shut it off like the water had told him something. He looked at the clock on the stove that was still 5 minutes fast. He looked at his coat on the chair and the empty hook by the door where his cap usually hung. He reached for the coat, hesitated, and left it. He didn't feel cold. Not yet. There's a trick the day plays when it's about to change. It gets very ordinary right before the turn, like a magician asking you to look at the hand that isn't doing anything. The mail carrier slid envelopes through the slot with the soft slap paper makes. A dog 2 houses down barked once, and then remembered what was barking at and quieted. Someone started a car and let it idle too long. Maya watched the corner like it owed her money, not impatient. Present, a black SUV rolled by that wasn't one of the 3 in the photo, and her shoulders softened. She knew some of the faces that would be here if they came. She also knew they could be strangers and still feel like family the second they stepped out in a line you couldn't teach. Inside the shop, Walt adjusted his glasses and said not loud, "You boys doing okay?" It was an offer more than a question. Tyler nodded too fast. Nate set the rag down and finally looked up at the door. Really looked. The bell chimed for a woman returning a case she said didn't fit right, and they all acted like things were normal for 10 more minutes. That was the longest 10 minutes of the day. We could call what happened next arrival, but that makes it sound like a parade. It wasn't. It was a presence, the kind you feel through your shoes before your eyes catch up. Engines idle to quiet. Doors open with a soft thud you hear in parking lots everywhere. 12 men stepped onto asphalt like they were stepping onto a porch. No rush. No pose. Just people who knew how to share a space without making it theirs. Back in his kitchen, Elias checked the back door out of habit. Even though he wasn't leaving that way, he reached for the hook by the front, the one where the cap would have been, and his hand stopped in the air. He let it fall. He opened the door and paused with his palm on the wood. You learn, after a while, to mark small thresholds. He stepped out, pulled the door closed, and felt the latch catch with a sound that felt like a period. He started walking, the same pace he used on mornings with no plan. Maya saw the first man cross the sidewalk to the shop door and exhaled without knowing she'd been holding her breath. She didn't park close. She didn't need front row seats. You don't have to be next to a thing to feel it. She put her hands on the wheel again and watched the flock of starlings turn at the same time like they all shared one thought. In the shop, the bell above the door chimed, and every small sound in the room stood still to listen. The first man had silver at his temples and the kind of posture you can't fake. Another wore a jacket that had seen weather. One in the middle had the kind of calm that makes other people quit fidgeting. They didn't form a line. They didn't spread out like a posse in a movie. They just arranged themselves the way water fills a glass. Naturally, evenly, finding the shape without spilling. Tyler's mouth went dry. He didn't know why exactly. He just knew he'd rather be anywhere else, and also that he needed to be exactly here. Nate took half a step back, and then stopped because backing up felt wrong, like a door closing you didn't mean to close. Walt's hand stilled on the stack of forms. He glanced once at the wall where the rifle hung, and then back at the men. Peace doesn't always look soft. Sometimes it looks like this. Careful, steady, the kind of quiet that reminds you of rules nobody wrote down. The oldest of the 12 stepped forward a single pace. He didn't raise his chin. He didn't need to ask who to speak to. The room knew. And across town, a man with a limp and a good jacket walked past a mural where the river still looked blue. He didn't change his pace. He didn't check his phone. He moved like a sentence that knows exactly where it's going. They didn't fan out like security. They didn't cluster like a team huddle. They drifted into a half moon that made sense without tape on the floor. One man to the left, one to the right. The rest filling the middle, so the counter sat in the bowl of their attention. It wasn't rehearsed, but it looked practiced, the way a family moves around a kitchen without bumping elbows. The bell over the door gave one last tired ring, and then seemed to think better getting in the way. The room shrank a little, not physically. 4 walls are 4 walls, but in that way space gets smaller when everybody is tuned to the same frequency. The country song on the ceiling speaker found its own volume knob and turned itself down. The oldest of the group took a single step forward. Close up, you could see the silver threaded through his hair wasn't just at the temples. There were lines around his eyes that came from sun and from squinting at horizons, not from staring at screens. He didn't put his hands on the counter. He let them hang easy, like he had no intention of doing anything but talk. "Morning," he said. Not a question, not a test. Just a word placed gently in the middle of the room. Tyler swallowed, then remembered to answer. "Hey, morning." The older man nodded once, like he appreciated the effort. An hour ago, a man came in. 72, ball cap, moves careful. Asked about a rifle on your back wall. Nate felt heat climb the back of his neck, as if someone had cracked open a furnace door. "We have a lot of people through here," he said, voice light but not convincing. "What kind of rifle?" The man didn't look at the wall. He already knew. Wood stock, older build. You keep it polished so clean the grain looks like glass. Walt cleared his throat, a polite way of stepping into the conversation without shoving. "Can I help you gentlemen with something specific?" He was doing that calm manager thing where you make every word sound like a soft landing. "We're here for the same thing," he was. The older man said, and then let the sentence sit there without furniture. He didn't lean on it. He didn't make it heavy. It was already heavy enough. Somewhere behind the racks, a customer coughed in the quiet way people cough when they realize they're part of something and don't want to disturb its edges. The woman returned the case, took a small step back from the glass, and set the plastic down carefully, as if it were a bowl of water. Even the HVAC seemed to shift into a lower gear. Maya stood in the lot and watched through the front window, without pressing her face to the glass. She wasn't trying to spy. She was trying to make sure everyone in there remembered to breathe. Her hands had migrated to the pockets of her hoodie. She didn't clench them. She curled them around her keys out of habit, metal against palm, a small reminder that she was here, and this was real, and she could leave at any time and would, if staying turned into being in the way. Tyler owned the first move that wasn't purely instinct. He reached for the rag Nate had abandoned and missed by an inch, then let his hand fall, and decided not to pretend the miss hadn't happened. He lifted his gaze instead. When his eyes met the older man's, he felt something he couldn't put a word to, like standing at the edge of deep water, and realizing the dark beneath is not empty, it's full. The man didn't smile. He didn't need to. "What's your name?" he asked, not unkind. "Tyler." "Tyler," he repeated, and somehow made it sound like the beginning of a conversation that could go well. "We won't be long." Nate found his voice and tried to wrap it in customer service paper. "We, appreciate you stopping in. We do ask folks not to. We don't want a scene," another of the men said quietly, deeper voice, eyes steady. "We want a moment." That landed softly and then spread. Walt let out a breath. He didn't realize he'd been holding and stepped half a foot to the right, so he could see both clerks without turning his head. He'd run enough Saturday mornings to know what a bad morning felt like, and this wasn't that. This was a different category altogether. He wasn't sure it had a name. People outside the store slowed when they saw the silhouettes through the tinted glass. Not to stare, to calibrate. A dad with stroller paused long enough to tuck a blanket tighter around a sleeping toddler's feet, then moved on, pushing with a careful cadence all strollers find on uneven sidewalk. A teenager with a skateboard tapped the tail once. Instinct, then stopped tapping. The sky had that washed-out winter blue That makes you think of old photos. Inside, the older man spoke again. "We're looking for a member of our family," he said simply. He walked in here quiet. He walked out the same way. "We don't have a name," Tyler blurted, and immediately wished he had picked a different sentence, maybe one that didn't sound like a defense. "That's true," the man said. It wasn't an accusation. It was a fact placed on the counter between them. Something softened in Tyler's face. His posture changed by half an inch, but the room felt it. Nate cleared his throat. He didn't want to be the guy he'd been an hour ago. Sometimes that's how it works. You realize you don't like the last version of yourself, and you try on a better one without making a speech about it. He asked to see the M1, Nate said. We told him no. The last 3 words came out small, as if saying them any louder might make them stick to his clothes. "Thank you," the older man said, and it sounded like he meant it. Not the content, but the honesty. There was a movement from the left side of the half moon. A man with quiet hands stepped forward and set something on the glass. Not a weapon. A small, clear frame. The cheap kind you buy at a drugstore. It held an old photo under plastic. 8 men in a line, dusty and sunburned. Eyes bright with that particular kind of tired you only get from finishing a job that mattered. No smiles exactly, but something close. The man in the center had a steadiness to him that made the whole line straighten. No names on the frame. No caption. Just faces that made the room feel older. Tyler leaned in before he could help himself. It was an instinct we all have. Get closer to the thing that might be important. Walt put a palm on the counter, not to claim the space, but to hold himself in place. The older man glanced at the photo like you look at a good friend's house when you drive by. A check-in, a nod. He didn't explain it. Not yet. He reached into a jacket pocket and pulled out a small cloth bundle. The edges singed, cord tied around the middle. He didn't untie it. He placed it next to the photo and rested his fingertips on the counter. Just enough pressure to say, "We're settled." Then he removed his hand. Nate's eyes tracked the cloth, locked on the darkened edges. He had a flicker of memory he couldn't place. His father sitting at a kitchen table late, reading by the light over the sink, the smell of something like pennies in the air. He blinked and the memory slid away. "Can I ask," Walt said careful, "what this is about? We don't want any trouble." He meant it exactly that way. Not in the defensive get-out sense, but in the sincere, we respect the room you're asking us to stand in. "No trouble," the older man said. "Just respect." He looked up at the wall behind them for the first time. His eyes found the rifle on the rack without wandering. He asked if he could hold it. He said, almost to himself, the way you say a line you've been turning over in your head on the drive-in. "Why?" Tyler said, not like a challenge. Like a student who just realized he'd missed a question early on and wanted a chance to make it right. "Because some things hold you back," the man answered, "and some things hold you up." A small knock sounded from the stockroom door. Not the door itself. Air in the frame, settling. Even the building seemed to lean in. Maya watched someone on the sidewalk put a hand to the glass and then, thinking better of it, pull back. She recognized the pull back, the wish not to smudge a moment. A pair of customers came in together. Quietly, the kind of friends who don't need to narrate their day to each other. They took one look at the semicircle, then instinctively moved to the side aisle and pretended to be interested in ear protection. You could see the decision on their faces. "We're here, but we're not in this." The older man gave the room another breath of time. You can tell when a person knows how to use silence. It's not passive. It's intentional, like setting a table and then waiting for people to sit. He finally said, "We don't need apologies. We don't need a show. We need you to know who he is when you see him. That's all." Nate glanced at the photo again, then at the bundle, then at the older man. His mouth opened and closed once. "We didn't ask," he said, more to himself than to anyone else. "We just decided." "Most folks do," one of the men on the right said. His voice carried sand and sun in it. "Day moves fast. People get turned into shapes. Hard to see the details when you're sprinting." Tyler's cheeks burned a little, but not from shame so much as from the sudden rush of wanting to do this part right. "If he comes back," he said, and made sure the words didn't wobble, "we'll treat him right." He hesitated, then added, We'd like to make that happen sooner than later. Walt picked up the cue. Managers are part conductor, part translator. We can take the M1 down, he offered, nodding toward the rack, if that's what he wanted to see. He was already stepping toward the back wall before anyone answered. It wasn't performance. It was a simple adjustment to the room's truth. The older man lifted a hand, not to stop him, just to put a word in the space first. He didn't come to be honored, he said. He came to remember something that carried him. You let a man do that. You're doing your job. Walt nodded. It landed. Understood. The word hovered in the air for a second. Tyler heard it the way he had heard an hour ago from a different mouth, and the repetition made his chest tighten. He didn't like that he'd missed the shape of it the first time. He wasn't going to miss it now. From afar in the store, a small sound, rubber sole on tile, announced a new customer. An older woman in a blue windbreaker stepped inside, blinked at the semicircle, and then did something that changed the temperature of the room by half a degree. She took off her cap, held it against her chest for a moment, and then tucked it into her pocket. Not a big thing, but intentional. She moved to the side, stood quietly, and let the moment keep being itself. Outside, a breeze ruffled the small flags in the bait shop, display, and flipped the corner of a flyer that had been stapled to a pole. So long the staples had rusted in place. The teenager with the skateboard rolled by again, slower this time, like gravity had shifted and was asking him to pay attention. Maya exhaled and felt her shoulders drop. Nobody was raising voices. Nobody was trying to win. They were doing something rarer. They were holding still. Back inside, the older man set his hand on the clear frame and slid it 3 inches closer to Clerk's, so they didn't have to lean across the counter. The faces in the photo got a little bigger. The man in the center was still the quiet center. You didn't need to know his name to feel why the half moon had formed. The cloth bundle sat beside it, unremarkable except for its edges, which told a story without words. We won't take up more of your time, the older man said. We said we'd be quick. We keep our word. He looked at Walt, then at Tyler, then at Nate, touching each person with a look that didn't label, didn't pin, just included. If he walks back in here and asks to hold what held him up, do him that courtesy. You'll find it pays off in ways that don't go in a drawer. Nobody moved. You could feel the next beat wanting to happen, and everyone agreeing, silently, to let it arrive when it was good and ready. Sir, Tyler said, and the word had weight now. What should we call him? So we don't keep saying that man like he's an idea. The older man's mouth twitched. It might have been the beginning of a smile or just a memory moving across his face. You can call him Gray, he said. He'll tell you the rest when he's ready. There was one more piece placed on the table, not for decoration but for use. The room accepted it. Walt finally stepped to the wall and reached up for the M1. He didn't touch it yet. He put his fingertips under the edge of the rack, then looked back for a nod he didn't technically need. The older man gave it. Walt lifted the rifle down the way you lift a sleeping child. Sure hands, steady breath, no extra movement. He set it on the counter, with the glass, metal to light, gentle as rain. The air changed, not with noise, with attention. Everyone in that room looked at the same object, and for a few seconds something like peace settled on the shelves. Outside, the diner door 2 blocks away opened, and Elias stepped into the daylight. He didn't hurry. He didn't slow. He moved at the exact speed of his life. The rifle sat on the glass like a story you could touch, with that remembered hands, metal that remembered weather. Walt stepped back an inch, palms open, as if to say, this isn't ours, but we'll keep it safe until it is. The oldest man looked at it, and, for a second, you could see him someplace else. Not far, just a half inch to the left of now. He blinked that distance away and let out a breath you only hear when a room is listening. Then he turned his attention to the small cloth bundle beside the photo. We don't unwrap this often, he said, his voice low enough that people at the back of the half moon leaned in without moving. And when we do, it's not to make a point. He loosened the cord with careful fingers. Not ceremonial careful, useful careful. The way you handle a thing that's been handled by people you love. The fabric opened in his hands and showed what it had been holding. A patch, scorched at one corner and stitched along one edge with thread that didn't match, a brass compass with spiderweb crack across its glass, and a small slip of laminated paper, yellowed, with a 4-digit grid written by someone who pressed hard when they wrote. He set the compass down first, then the patch, then the grid. He didn't arrange them like a display. He laid them the way you set down your keys and wallet when you come home. Nate's eyes went straight to the patch. He didn't know why that small square of fabric grabbed him harder than the old photo did. Maybe because it looked like something you could have in your own pocket, without realizing how much it carried. Tyler watched the compass and felt, weirdly, a little seasick, like standing on a dock and knowing the boards are still but the waves under them aren't. The older man rested 2 fingers on the edge of the compass, not touching the glass. "This cracked on a day I was sure I was done," he said, almost conversational. It kept pointing anyway. A small smile, gone as soon as it appeared. Not north, just onward. He let the room take that in, then turned his hand palm up and lifted the patch. The singed corner trembled slightly on his fingertips. "He pulled this off my shoulder when a lot of other things were coming off all at once," he said. The sentence didn't ask for pity. It didn't even ask to be understood. It just wanted to be heard. Stitched it back on with whatever thread he could find. Said, "You'll want this where people can see it." I told him nobody was looking. He said, "We are..." He set the patch down. The room didn't exhale so much as settle. Walt's face changed in a way you only notice if you've spent years dealing with people. A tilt around the eyes. Something like recognition, not the story, but the shape truth makes on a person. "And this," the older man said, tapping the laminated grid lightly with a fingernail that had seen tools in years, "is a place only a few of us could find on a map. I still keep it because some spots in this world hold a kind of gravity. Doesn't matter if you're standing there or not. You feel the pull." Tyler swallowed. "Sir," he said, not to sound formal, just to keep himself from blurting. How do you know? Gray." The older man let the name sit in the air like a note that rings true. "He picked me up," he said, "more than once. Sometimes that meant an arm under my shoulder. Sometimes it meant 2 sentences at a time when my head wasn't right. He's the kind of man who doesn't add words to a room unless they're the right ones." He let his hands fall to his sides. "He's also the kind of man who will never correct you if you misjudge him. He'll just let you have it, and he'll take his leave, and you won't know what you missed until a long time later when it shows up like a bill." No one moved. You could feel everyone try and make room in their head for 2 truths at once. The quiet old guy and the man the room was describing. From the edge of the semicircle, another voice joined in. Younger. You could hear the Midwest in it, but softened by years of sleeping in places that don't care where you're from. "First time I met him, he didn't tell me who he was," the man said. "He asked me if I had water. I told him I was fine. He said, that wasn't my question. I handed him my canteen. He didn't drink. He put it back in my pack and said, 'Now you do.' That's who we're talking about." Tyler nodded like he was filing that away under a tab labeled lessons I should have had sooner. Walt cleared his throat softly, more a sigh than a sound. "I'd like to reach him," he said. And the word like was doing a lot of work, keeping the sentence from turning into a demand. "If you're comfortable sharing a way to do that. If not, I'll respect that too." He glanced at the M1 and the photo and the cloth bundle, then back at the older man. "But if he wants to come back, we'll be ready." Maya, from the car, watched Walt take out his phone. She appreciated that he didn't hold it up like a badge. He kept it low, personal. She watched him open his contacts, stop, and close it again, realizing he didn't have who he needed. That small pause of honesty, it matters. She knew this part from a different life. The hardest step is the one where you admit you can't do the next step alone. The older man didn't make Walt ask twice. He nodded toward the door. "He's got a rhythm," he said. "Diner, back booth, mid-morning most days. He'll be on the left side where the light doesn't hit his eyes. He doesn't like glare. You send someone who knows how to use their inside voice and ask him if today's a good day to hold a memory. Don't crowd him. Don't tell him what you've done to the rifle since he left. Let him set the pace." Walt pocketed the phone without typing a thing, like he was worried typing would scare the instruction away. "I can walk over," he said. "It's 2 blocks." "Take your time," the older man said, "and bring a chair with you, even if you don't sit in it." He let the confusion flicker and then explained, soft. "Bringing a chair means you're planning to stay if he wants you, and you're ready to leave if he doesn't. People feel that." Tyler looked at the M1 again. When he spoke, his voice found a steadier lane. "If he wants, we can set the case aside. Give him space. Close the register for a minute." He paused. "We can make the room fit the moment, not the other way around." One of the men on the right side of the half moon nodded, almost imperceptible. You could tell he was the kind of person who doesn't hand out approval lightly, and so, when he did, it landed. Nate, who had spent the last hour wishing he could rewind the morning, took a small step forward. He kept his hands visible, palms empty. "For what it's worth," he said, and the phrase didn't feel like filler this time, "I'm sorry I didn't ask. I'm not saying that to look good. I'm saying it because I heard what you said, and I don't want to be that guy again." The older man looked at him for a beat that was kinder than mercy. "Noted," he said. "Do something with it now." That's how sorry turns into better. Maya felt her eyes sting and roll them at herself because tears weren't on the list today. She picked up a napkin from the console and dabbed once, annoyed and grateful at the same time. Her phone buzzed. A text from a number that never used names. "We're headed to the diner, end of hour." She typed back a thumbs up and then deleted it, typing instead, "I'll hang back." Inside, the older man tapped the corner of the photo. "You don't need the origin story," he said. "Just know this picture was taken after a day none of us had words for." He stood in the middle because the tripod was crooked and he had the steadiest stance. "That's all. That's everything." Walt nodded toward the patch. "Do you want to take these with you?" he asked. "We won't pretend we deserve to keep them." "We don't leave them," the older man said, "but we leave something else." He glanced at one of his teammates, who reached into a pocket and brought out a small coin, heavy for its size, smooth at the edges from being turned over many times. The man didn't flash it or make a quarter trick flourish. He set it on the glass next to the rifle, silver face up. "No emblems, no Latin. Just wait. We leave this as a reminder," he said, "that some rooms change you, and that you could decide not to change back." Tyler's fingers twitched like he wanted to touch it and knew he shouldn't. He tucked both hands under the counter to keep them honest. "Let me go to him," Walt said, eyes on the older man. "If today's not the day, I'll come back and tell you that too." He looked at Tyler and Nate. "You hold the fort. Keep the room the way it is. Don't let anybody turn the volume up." Nate nodded. Tyler said, "Yes, sir," and didn't hear himself until it came out. He didn't correct it. The older man gathered the compass and the patch and the grid back into cloth, tied it with the same steady fingers, and placed it in his jacket. "We'll step out," he said. "We weren't here to take up space. We were here to make sure the space was ready." He looked at the M1 one more time, not with nostalgia, but with respect, the way you gnawed at an old bridge that still holds. If he asked to hold it, you place it in his hands like you're handing him back a chapter. Then you let him do the reading. They turned as one without making it look like a drill and headed for the door. The bell offered a single small chime, almost apologetic, and then went quiet. The half moon dissolved like salt in warm water. People in the store remembered how to breathe out loud. The room didn't bounce back to normal. Exactly. It found a new normal and liked it better. Walt reached below the counter and pulled out a folding chair, then looked a little surprised at himself, like the suggestion had planted itself and grown roots immediately. He slid the rifle gently into an empty case behind the register, where he could reach it without fuss. "I'll be back," he told the clerks, and then to the room as if it could hear him. "Don't let this moment get noisy." Outside, the air felt brighter without getting warmer. The group moved across the lot without hurry, peeling off toward their vehicles without breaking the thread that had connected them inside. Maya watched them through the windshield and felt that thunk in her chest, the one that says, "You were lucky enough to see something true today." She turned the key, and the engine hummed like it had been waiting for permission. 2 blocks away, the diner bell made its tired little sound, and nobody looked up because it always makes that sound. Elias had already finished his coffee and was counting coins in his pocket like he always did. Not because the amount mattered, but because the habit did. The waitress wiped the counter with that end-of-morning rhythm and set a slice of pie inside the glass case like a promise for later. Back at the shop, Tyler stared at the photo. He didn't know exactly why, but he felt taller and smaller at the same time. Nate reached for a pen and a scrap of paper and wrote 2 words in block letters, then slid it under the corner of the photo as if the photo needed a caption. The words were simple: be better. Walt hit the crosswalk button and didn't jaywalk like he might on a different day. He waited for the light to change. He listened to the quiet tick inside the signal box. He practiced a line in his head, not because he wanted to perform it, but because he wanted to keep it short and true. He smiled when he realized he didn't need a line at all. He just needed to show up with that chair. Word travels funny in a small town. It doesn't take a headline. It takes a handful of people who were there and one photo that isn't even that good. By the time Walt reached the corner, a version of the scene inside the shop had already hopped from text thread to text thread. No sirens, no shouting, 12 men standing still like a word you don't say out loud. Nobody had the whole story. Everybody felt the same tug. He crossed with a light, the folding chair tucked under his arm. It looked a little ridiculous, and that was the point. Ridiculous puts people at ease. He could see the diner's window from halfway down the block, glass throwing back the winter sun in a way that made everything look extra honest. He paused at the door, listened to Bell give its tired jingle, and stepped into the warmth that smells like coffee and bacon no matter what time of day it is. Elias sat in his usual booth on the left, back to the wall, not hiding, just placed. You get used to rooms in a certain way when you spent years in rooms you didn't choose. He had the relaxed posture of a man who knows where the exits are, but doesn't need to look at them. The waitress glanced up, clocked the chair under Walt's arm, and tilted her chin once like they were on the same page without having met. Walt didn't rush. He set the folding chair down at the end of the booth, close enough to mean something, far enough not to box anyone in. "Mr. Mercer," he said, keeping his voice in that lane restaurants are built for. "I'm Walt. I run the shop down the block." Elias's eyes moved from the chair to Walt's face. "You brought furniture," he said, and there was a dry edge in it. Not sharp, not cruel, just human. Walt nodded. Seemed smart to come ready to stay or to leave. "Your call." That got him the smallest lift at the corner of Elias's mouth, which is a lot from a man like that. The waitress slid by, topped off the mug without interrupting the thread, and patted the corner of the table like she was blessing it. Walt kept standing until Elias tilted his head at the chair. "Might as well sit," he said. "I don't want to be the only one getting old in here." Walt sat. The chair didn't creak. He took that as a sign. He didn't launch into a speech. He took a breath and said the simplest thing he had. "We didn't do right by you an hour ago." He let the words sit there without trying to dress them up. "I won't promise we'll never mess up again. I will promise we'll listen better. If you're willing, I'd like to make it right today. No ceremony. Just you and a memory that belongs to you." Elias looked out the window instead of at Walt. Across the street, a woman in a red coat chose a direction at the corner and committed to it. Somewhere a delivery truck hit a pothole and clanged a rhythm. He set his hand around the mug, not to drink, to anchor the moment. "You don't owe me anything," he said. "Maybe," Walt answered, "but we owe the room something, and we owe ourselves better habits." He rubbed his thumb over a callus on his palm. "We got a little coin sitting on the counter. Now, that makes the register look like it's thinking. We got your name, finally, and a rifle waiting on a glass like a book somebody meant to return." He shrugged. "Feels like a good day to fix one thing." Elias didn't move for a long heartbeat. Then he nodded once. "All right." Walt stood, but not too fast, like he didn't want to scare the yes away. "I'll walk with you if that's okay. If not, I'll meet you there." "Walk's fine," Elias said. He reached into his coat pocket, laid cash on the table, exact change, of course, and slid out of the booth. The waitress squeezed his shoulder as he passed, then looked at Walt with a kind of quiet approval that makes grown men straighten their posture without meaning to. They stepped out into the winter brightness. Two men keeping a pace that respected a knee that had earned its complaints. Walt didn't talk. Elias didn't either. There's a kind of silence that feels like pressure. This wasn't that. This was comfortable. They'd passed a mural where the river still managed to be blue under all that peeling paint. A kid on a scooter zipped by and gave them a you-got-this grin that felt like a good omen. By the time they reached the gun shop, the lot had collected a few more parked cars and a hush that didn't come from rules. The 12 men weren't in sight. That wasn't surprising. They don't linger. That's part of the point. Maya stepped out her car when she saw Elias and Walt together, and then stopped herself from getting closer. Useful, not nosy. She gave Elias a small nod, palm at her chest like a secret salute. He dipped his chin in return. Inside, Tyler had straightened 100 things that didn't need straightening, and Nate had written "Be Better" on 3 more sticky notes he didn't plan to leave anywhere. When the bell chimed and Elias crossed the threshold, both of them stood a touch taller than they would have yesterday. Without trying, Walt moved behind the counter and, without a speech or flourish, opened the case where he'd set the rifle. He didn't pick it up immediately. He looked at Elias. Same as before, he said, "Your pace. Your rules." Elias came closer. The floor didn't squeak under his boots. He put his hand on the glass like he had an hour ago, but the room around it had changed shape. Tyler stepped back just enough to make space without making a scene. Nate glanced at the door and then at the older woman in the blue windbreaker, who'd wandered back in and now stood with her cap in her hand again, like she'd been waiting for Act 2 without knowing it. Walt lifted the rifle, that same careful child-lifting way. He set it in Elias's hands. No one else touched it. No one hovered. No one narrated. Elias took the weight the way you take back a word you shouldn't have given away. He didn't shoulder it. He didn't aim. He let the barrel point down and just held it. The room let out a collective breath. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't church. It was a retail space at 12:30 on a Saturday, and for once that felt exactly sacred enough. Elias ran his thumb along the grain, then stopped at a small nick near the sling swivel. He smiled, really smiled, not big, but true. "Always in the same place," he said softly, mostly to himself. "Right where your hand wants to rest when you're tired." Tyler found himself asking a question with his voice low, like you do at someone else's family reunion. "What do you remember most?" He winced at his own forwardness and added quickly, "If you want to say." Elias didn't make him squirm. He tilted the rifle, watching the light move along the metal. "Wait," he said. "Now how heavy? How honest? It tells you the truth about the miles. It never lies about what it costs to carry something and still go." The line lodged somewhere under Tyler's ribs. He nodded like a person filing words in a place that gets used. News doesn't need a camera crew anymore. A guy who walked in to buy a case for a guitar didn't raise his phone, but he did take a single slow photo at waist height. The kind you take when you want to remember how a room felt, not what people wore. By sunset, that photo would sit on a neighborhood page with a caption that said nothing but the town's name and a small blue heart. It would do what good pictures sometimes do. Remind people they already knew how to act. They'd just forgotten for a bit. Walt stepped back, keeping a respectful distance, and saw that Maya had slipped in and taken a spot near the end cap. She met his eye and gave a tiny nod that said, "That's enough. Don't add more." He appreciated the coaching. Nate cleared his throat. He'd been waiting for his turn to do one thing right today and felt it arrive. He reached under the counter and brought out a small, clear stand he grabbed from a display that didn't need it. He set on the glass and slid the photo into it, so it stood upright, faces looking out, not down. He didn't put a label on it. He didn't tape a story to the side. He let the picture be the picture. "Sir," the older woman in the windbreaker said to Elias, not loud, not shy, "my brother wore a cap like yours. He didn't talk much either. I wish I'd asked more while I had the chance." Her voice wobbled on the last word, and then straightened up like it remembered its posture. "Thank you for letting us be here." Elias's eyes softened. He didn't give a speech back. "You showing up's enough," he said. Walt could feel the shop breathing. People weren't buying a thing. They were buying the idea that a room could hold grace if you arranged it right. He picked up a pen and, in his awful block letters, wrote a single line on a piece of cardstock and slid it into a frame next to the stand. It wasn't poetry. It didn't need to be. It said, "He carried it once. We'll carry the memory now." Tyler stepped to the door and turned the lock halfway, not to shut people out, but to shift the tone. He flipped the sign to back in 10 and then, sheepish, turned it back. No need to make it cute. Instead, he took a piece of painter's tape and put a slim strip across the threshold with a sharpened note. "Quiet, please." It felt right and temporary, like an usher's hand. Word kept humming. A teacher from the high school peeked in, recognized the shape of the moment, and left without crossing the tape. She walked straight to the hardware store, bought a shadow box, and carried it back like a casserole. "When you're ready," she told Walt, "we'll mount whatever you choose. We've got a hallway with a blank space that's been waiting for a story." Across town, the VFW posted a 2-sentence note on their board. "If you know Gray, you know. If you don't, you'll learn. No tags. No hashtags. Just a direction." There was a kind of soft crisis unfolding. Not the kind that knocks shelves over, the kind that rearranges what people reach for first. The clerks, who'd spent all morning practicing fast hands and faster lines, found themselves moving slower and liking it better. The manager, who'd been trained to measure days and receipts, felt another kind of profit stacking up in a place you can't count. After a while, no one could say how long, Elias handed the rifle back to Walt. There was a second where you could see him miss the weight even as he let it go. Walt set it down with the same care he'd used picking it up any time, he said, and meant it like you mean a promise you want someone to test. "No appointment. Just walk in." Elias nodded. He took one small step back, then another. The room didn't crowd him with gratitude. It made space. The older woman put her cap back on. Tyler wiped the spot that finally existed. Nate exhaled a breath that sounded like a good night's sleep feels. Maya met Elias at the door. "Good to see you," she said. He gave her that same small chin dip. "You too." They didn't say more. They didn't need to. Outside, small things had gathered against a brick near the entrance. Somebody had started it without announcements. A white flower, a coin that had been taped to a note that just said respect in careful cursive. A challenge coin that wasn't shiny anymore. Walt saw the little pile and didn't try to manage it. He let the town tell its story in objects instead of speeches. By late afternoon, the local paper posted a few lines online. A quiet moment at Mercer Arms today reminded us that history doesn't always live in books. Sometimes it walks past us on the sidewalk. The comments, for once, stayed kind. Not everybody loved the attention. There were a couple of folks who wanted to turn it into a debate about something broader. The thread didn't bite. It slid past like water around a rock. The day was set to a different station. Back at the diner, the waitress put a slice of pie in a to-go box and set it on the counter, without a name, knowing exactly who it was for. Elias would come by later. Or he wouldn't. Either way, the pie was a promise that somebody saw him. When the sun loosened and dropped toward the roofs, Walt locked up early, not to shut people out, but to give the room a chance to hold what it had just held without getting trampled by the rest of Saturday. He and the clerk stood in the doorway a second, shoulder to shoulder, not saying the kind of grand summary that would cheapen it. "We're different," Tyler said finally, simple as flipping a light. "We should keep being different tomorrow." "Yeah," Nate said, "let's make tomorrow quieter on purpose." Walt flipped the lock and felt the click in his hand. "We'll open with the rifle on the counter for a while," he said. "No price tag. No glass. Just a story you can touch if you ask the right way." Across town, porch lights started flicking on, one by one, the way they do when a neighborhood agrees it's time to soften the edges. The SUVs that had come and gone left no trace, but the echo of good boots on tile and a coin on a counter. Maya texted a single line to the number that didn't use names. He held it. The reply came back quick. "Good. Then, we'll see him when it's quiet." People felt taller, walking their dogs that evening. Not proud, just more themselves. A barber closed up shop and stood for a second in his doorway, looking at the chair like it had done its job well today, even though it was a haircut chair and not a folding one. The mural by the river looked a little brighter in the dusk, even though nobody had touched it. Elias took the long way home, because days like this deserve longer edges. He didn't bring the pie back from the diner yet. He'd get it later, or not. He paused at his porch, hand on the rail, and watched the stray cat claim the cinder block wall like a throne. He laughed once, a quiet cough laugh, and then went inside to a house that smelled like coffee and old paper and something new he couldn't name yet. He didn't open the closet. He didn't need to. He took the small notebook from the shelf, flipped to the first page, and under hold steady he wrote one more line in block letters. Let them carry some. The town didn't tilt on its axis. It just settled into a better groove, the way a record finds the right track after a skip. Not perfect, not permanent, but better enough to notice. Morning came on like a dimmer switch, not a light. The kind of blue that makes the street look freshly washed. The diner woke the way it always did. Coffee first, then the clink of forks, then the doorbell finding its voice. Elias Gray, Mercer, took his usual path down the sidewalk, hand grazing the tops of car hoods the way people do like to measure the day's temperature by touch. He didn't bring the cap. He didn't need it. The habit had already done its job. Inside, the waitress had set the left side booth the way she always did for him. Napkin folded sharp, mug upside down because he liked to turn it himself. It's a small thing, turning your own mug. It says, "I'm here by choice." She looked up when he stepped in, and her hello wasn't performance. It was the kind of greeting that makes your shoulders drop a half inch. He slid into the booth and took a second to face the room. Not to check exits, not today. To mark the faces that belonged to this morning. An older couple sharing a crossword. A kid in a hoodie stirring too much sugar into a cocoa. A mail carrier stepping out with her satchel like a promise. He turned the mug upright. Steam rose almost immediately, like the room had been holding its breath. Across town, folks were still passing around last night's photo from the shop. Most of them didn't know what exactly they were feeling. They just knew it was good. Walt saw those pixels for a second while he tied his apron on a hook in the back, and then set his phone face down like a person telling himself, later. He tucked a folded chair under his arm out of habit now, like a pen, like a pocket knife, and stepped into the day. Maya parked the way she always parked when she chose to be there, but not in it. 2 doors down, half a car length off the corner, an exit lane built into the choice. She took a breath, checked her pulse for no good reason, and laughed at herself. Useful, not nosy, she said out loud like a mantra. Her fingers found the small ring on her necklace and spun it once. The ring was plain. It had belonged to her father. It was later than usual for the lunch crowd, earlier than usual for the kids leaving school. The timing was odd and perfect. The bell above the diner door gave one tired jingle, and then a second, and then 12 more in a rhythm that didn't sound like a line or a march. It sounded like a group of people who had agreed not to rush. They came in one at a time, as if they'd all remembered the exact same errand at the exact same minute. They didn't fill the room. They settled into it. A nod to the counter. A nod to the cook. A glance to the left where the light doesn't hit your eyes. They didn't look at Elias like he was fragile or famous. They looked at him the way you look at a person you know in your bones. The youngest, barely old enough to have a mortgage, definitely old enough to know when to speak, stopped at the edge of the booth. "Sir," he said, and the word didn't feel stiff. It felt right-sized. "If it's all right, we'd like to sit with you." Elias looked at the empty side of the booth, and then at the end where a chair could live. He tapped the table twice, the way you do when you're making a decision your body already made. Pull up. The waitress was already there with a stack of mugs. The handle of each one turned so a right hand could grab it without clatter. She set them down like a dealer who knows how to make cards land silent. Then she did something she'd never done in this diner. Not once, not in 32 years. She set one mug upside down in the center of the table and left it there. No one touched it. The meaning was obvious without a speech. They didn't order. Coffee showed up anyway. Sugar, cream, a plate of toast nobody claimed, and everybody shared. The cook leaned on the pass and watched without watching. People at nearby tables went about their lives on purpose. Forks moved. Laughter happened at a respectable volume. The room understood the assignment. be normal, but better. It wasn't a conversation so much as a rhythm, a hand around a warm cup, a glance that said more than a paragraph. Snatches, sure, 2 sentences here, 3 there. You sleeping at all? The older one asked, eyes still kind. Enough? Elias said, which is the right answer even when it isn't exact. How's the knee? Another asked, like he was inquiring about the weather. Likes to remind me it's still mine, Elias said, and that got the right amount of laugh. The youngest waited. He wasn't performing patience. He just had it. When the moment belonged to him, it felt obvious. He reached into his jacket and laid a thin envelope on the table. The paper had gone soft at the edges from being handled. He slid it forward with 2 fingers. Careful not to bump anyone's mug. My mom asked me to give you this, he said. She kept it a long time. Elias didn't reach. He let the envelope sit there. Your mom? Yes, sir. A small breath. Her last name's Collins. The name landed like a penny in a deep well. Not loud, not light. Elias's eyes didn't change much, but the air near the table did. He put his hand on the envelope without opening it. The paper was thin enough to tell him there was 1 page inside, maybe 2. He looked at the young man, the way you look at a road you took once without seeing all of it. You look like him, he said. So I hear, the young man said, and smiled the kind of smile that knows it carries 3 people, not 1. Maya closed her eyes in the car and whispered, Okay, Dad. She hadn't planned to say anything. She didn't need to. The room in there had it. Elias opened the envelope. No ceremony. Just his finger on the flap, the way you do with mail that isn't junk. He slid out a page that had been folded long ways, handwritten in a block print that used to be steadier. There were coffee rings ghosting the corners like halos. He didn't read it out loud. He didn't need to, but the young man did, softly, because it was his mother's favorite part, and he knew exactly where it lived on the page. If I don't make it back to sit with Collins in that awful diner he loves, he read, smiling. Somebody go sit with his boy when he's grown and tell him his dad likes sour coffee, bad jokes, and finish what he started. Tell him I kept a seat open wherever I went. Tell him to keep one open, too. The waitress, who wasn't supposed to hear because she wasn't supposed to be there, wiped her cheek with the back of her wrist and pretended it was steam. The cook blinked at the grill and flipped bacon that didn't need flipping. The mug upside down in the center of the table stayed where it was. Elias set the letter down like it weighed something. I wrote that, he said, almost amused at himself. I forgot I wrote that. That's what she said. The young man answered. Said it showed up in the mail a lifetime ago with no return address. Said you signed it with a name and a number that weren't yours. Said she figured if you wanted thanks, you'd have left an easier trail. He tapped the corner of the envelope. She told me to tell you the coffee got better. That's a lie, Elias said, deadpan. And everyone laughed real and soft, because it felt good to laugh in there. The older teammate reached into his pocket and placed that small coin, the one from the shop, next to the upside-down mug. He didn't explain it to the room. He didn't need to. Elias glanced at it and nodded. It was their way of reserving a place without claiming it. A portable table for 2, or 12, or just 1. Walt came in partway through with a folding chair under his arm. He stopped 2 steps from the booth because you don't walk into a melody mid-verse with muddy boots. He set the chair down near the end, but didn't open it. He just left it there, leaning an option. Elias caught his eye and tipped his chin. Walt tipped his chin back and didn't say a single word because he finally understood the value of not narrating the obvious. They stayed like that for a while, long enough for the coffee to cool and get refilled without anyone asking. A couple from out of town wandered in and felt immediately that this wasn't the morning to complain about the draft by the door. They took a counter seat and ended up talking about their son's science project with the cook, who had some very strong, very correct opinions about baking soda volcanoes. At some point, the upside-down mug in the middle of the table got turned upright. No one would later be able to say who flipped it. It just happened, and that was the moment the room got bigger. Not louder, not busier. Bigger, like it could hold one more chair and one more story without creaking. The twist wasn't a reveal that changed the past. It was a thread that made the past make more sense. Maya stepped in then, quiet, hands in her pockets like always, and hovered an arm's length from the booth. The older teammate looked up and smiled in a way you could feel in your shoulders. "Maya," he said. Elias glanced up. "Rios." She nodded, eyes bright but steady. "He liked this place," she said. So the eggs were honest. That got another smile out of Elias. Different this time, a memory half standing behind his shoulder. "He told me once," she added, "if you want to take care of people, learn to see when they want company and when they want quiet." She lifted a palm. "I figured today you wanted company, so I made a call." The older teammate tapped the laminated grid. He still kept folded in his wallet. "Your father drew this number on a napkin in the kitchen the night he came home," he said. "Said it's the spot he keeps in his head when he needs to stand still. That number's in this envelope, too." He nodded at the letter. "Looks like the message made the whole loop." Maya looked at the upside-down then right-side-up mug in the center and let herself cry for 3 seconds. Exactly. And then smiled like a person who picked the right day to sit with her grief. "Thanks," she said. Not to the room. To the booth. Elias folded the letter and tucked it back in the envelope like you tuck a blanket around a sleeping kid. He set it next to the coin and the mug, then pushed the envelope across the table to the young man. "Keep it," he said. "Bring it back when you need to." The young man nodded. "Yes, sir." They didn't stay long enough to make a scene. They stayed just long enough to make a point. When the first of them stood, the rest stood with him, not in unison, not like a drill, like people whose ankles agree on time. They left as they'd come, one by one, with murmurs and nods and that careful way of tucking a chair back in without scraping the floor. The bell over the door sang them out. The room didn't snap back. It eased back, like a sweater settling on your shoulders. The waitress took the upside-down right-side-up mug and washed it herself, then set it back at the end of the counter with a saucer under it like a candle. Walt picked up the folding chair and looked at it like he might hang it on the wall as a joke and a rule. He didn't. He left it leaning by the kitchen door. The cook pointed a spatula at him. "That belongs to this place now," he said. "You can borrow it." "Fair," Walt said, grinning. Elias stayed a minute more, long enough for the room to turn back into a room. He put the letter in his inside pocket. He put a tip under the sugar caddy where he always hid it, so the waitress didn't give it back. He stood with that careful spine and thanked the coffee like it had done a good job. On his way out, he paused by Maya. "You did good," he said. "I learned from someone who never talked about it," she said. "That's the best kind of teacher," he answered. They stepped into the bright cold and let the door fall shut behind them. The town didn't crowd them. It gave them a street and a sky and the sound of a bus sighing at a stop. A kid on a BMX rolled past, slower than yesterday, nodding like he was in on something. Windows held faces for a second, then went back to being windows. Back at the shop, the M1 sat on the counter for the afternoon with a little handwritten card. Beside it, that didn't sell anything. People came in and asked quiet questions, and sometimes didn't ask anything at all. They just looked. A high school history teacher brought her class list and wrote a new assignment on the board for Monday. Find a person in your town who carries a story without saying it. Ask permission to listen. By dark. The coin was back in the pocket. The photo returned to its clear frame. The sign on the door flipped to close with a steadier hand. Walt lingered at the register long enough to realize the day had left him with less to count and more to keep. He locked up and walked past a mural that still hadn't been repainted. Funny thing, it looked brighter anyway. Epilogue sneaks up like that. Not a big speech. Just small proof that something changed. The barber went home and found himself pulling the chair away from the wall a few inches, giving it more space like a person. The teacher picked up a frame and dusted it with her sleeve. The mail carrier tucked a note into her bag to drop at a certain left side booth tomorrow. "The coffee's on me next time. You don't have to drink it." As for Elias, he took the long way down the block because routine is comfort and comfort is earned. He didn't check his phone because there was nothing on it. He needed more than the cold on his cheeks and the taste of coffee lingering at the edges. He paused at his gate, looked up at a sky that had one stubborn star in it in spite of the streetlights, and allowed himself one private grin. Then he went inside to the house that now smelled a little less like old paper and a little more like company. Here's the part people don't talk about much. Respect doesn't fix everything. It doesn't rewrite the hours you wish you could edit, but it steadies the table. It gives you hands to pass the heavy things to for a minute. It teaches you to bring a chair. If this reminds you of someone who never asked for applause, someone who carried weight without talking about it, say their name out loud. Write it down where other people can see it. Tell one story about them, not their legend, their groceries, their laugh, their favorite booth with a light that doesn't hit your eyes. And if stories like this feel like the kind that ought to keep traveling, stick around for the next one. Hit subscribe so we don't lose each other between episodes.